Hello everyone and welcome to the next episode of Beyond the Broadcast. For those of you that are watching for the first time, where have you been? But also I'm Alex Williamson, a senior newsroom producer here at Markettiers, which is the UK's leading broadcast PR agency. Now we're really excited to bring you insights into the world of broadcast PR through our interviews that we do here on Beyond the Broadcast. And today I'm joined by two special guests. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Alex Blakemore, a fundamental member of our world-class newsroom team. You don't have to be called Alex to be in our team, there are other names. But Alex is an experienced TV and radio producer and joined us this year following his time at the BBC and GB News. And our second guest today is a very special guest and also a friend and former colleague of Alex's. So Alex, it sort of only seems fitting if you do this bit of the introduction.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate that. And thanks for such a lovely introduction as well. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching. And yes, as you'll be able to see by this fabulous bunting in the background, which we spent hours and endless money on, very plastic, to create, we are doing a special episode today for the coronation of King Charles III. And who better to give us some true insight into the broadcasting efforts that go into a royal event than a former BBC Royal Correspondent. So I'm delighted to welcome to this episode the wonderful Michael Cole. Hi, Michael.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, before we get going, Alex has got a bit more of a formal introduction.
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of background about why Michael is such a special guest and so important to this podcast today. Following an established career in journalism where he worked as a reporter for the BBC for almost 3 decades, and not just here in England or the UK, no, 65 countries. Michael then took on the role of Director of Public Affairs for Harrods, and thus as a spokesman for its owner, Mohammed Al Fayed. His most recent venture is his very own. It's a public relations and broadcasting company for which he is chairman.
What a career, Michael. You've done so much. Now, we're here to talk about, obviously, the impending coronation and the mammoth amount of work that goes into broadcasting this sort of event. So I guess the first question should be, what can we expect from the coronation?
What we're dealing with here could not be more important. The coronation is very big news indeed. In the last 200 years, there have been more full solar eclipses than there have been coronations. There's only been 7 coronations. The last one was 70 years ago. So what we're going to see on May the 6th is something exceptional. It's often famously said that Britain doesn't have a written constitution, but it does have a coronation. And this is central to the life we live in this country, every single one of us, as subjects of the crown, because we're not citizens, we're subjects of the crown, in a parliamentary monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. And what we'll see on the 6th of May is essentially, it's like a marriage between the new monarch and his people, the realm of the United Kingdom, and 14 other overseas realms. The vows are read out loud. It's a marriage contract, if you will. There's even a ring that goes upon his finger. And central to the whole thing is a theme of loyalty, because the king himself will be asked if he's the right person to be king. And that will depend upon whether he is prepared to take the coronation oath. Now, this is big medicine. He has to swear, if he's ready to do it, to be loyal to God, to the people, and to the Anglican Church, the Protestant Church, of which he is the supreme governor. And only when he has made that oath, he's taken that oath, made that vow, will he be anointed on his hands, on his arms, and on his breast. And only when he's been anointed can he be crowned. And only when he is crowned do the bishops and the lords, the peers who are there, and indeed his eldest son, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, only then do they kneel and they pledge their fealty, their loyalty to the new king. And this isn't just pantomime. This is real. And in the old days, it meant something, because it was a very dangerous moment when you changed reigns, and the king had to know who his friends were and if they were on his side. So this process is not democratic in that sense, but there is the element of consent. Does he consent to be the king, and do we consent to have him as the king? And this is central to our lives. So pomp and circumstance, bejeweled crowns and so on. But what it's really about is him taking on the burdens. And when he's given the instruments of power, the orb and the scepter, those are the instruments of his new power, not to be used for his own glory, but to be used in the service of God and the service of the people. So I would say in the whole of his reign, in the whole of any reign, this is the most supreme moment, and it's a very solemn one. Parts of it will not be seen, some of the anointing and so on, which happened also with the Queen when her breast was anointed with holy oil. It is sacred and is also temporal, because he then takes over the power. Because in this country, our system, the Westminster system that we have, the monarch reigns but does not rule. Parliament is sovereign. Parliament has the power, but the king is there as the head of state.
So it's quite an intimate moment, really, for King Charles III. But the eyes of the nation and the world, and also the cameras and recorders for broadcasters across the entire world, will be on that moment. How much planning goes into an event like this?
A huge amount of planning. For the last 30 years, from the time that the Queen got to be 50, they will have game planned the coronation coverage. Of course, it's very different from last time, because on June the 2nd, 1953, when the Queen was crowned, you can say absolutely that that was the beginning of the television age in this country, because people for the first time saw the sense in going out and buying a cathode ray tube. They bought a 9-inch or even a 12-inch black and white set. My father went to Curry's in Wembley High Street and bought a HMV console, very posh set. And my mother had said previously, we're never going to have a television set in this house. It's a goggle box for idiots. But there we are. She wanted it. And we, in this small close of houses, of 12 houses, in the back room, we had 17 people watching the coronation. I didn't think we had 17 seats in our house, but by using the piano stool, we all got seated. And people sat there watching, can you imagine, a 12-inch black and white 504 line screen for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours. So that was the beginning of the television age. And it was the beginning for one reason only. The Duke of Edinburgh had said to his wife, the Queen, we are going to have television in the coronation ceremony itself, the ritual. There were lots of people saying to him, no, it's not going to happen. We're not going to allow it. And previously, the coronation of her father in 1937 had not been televised at all. But Edinburgh had the foresight to say it's the right thing. And rather reluctantly, they allowed the cameras in. And the BBC, and there was only one channel in 1953, the BBC had a lead presenter, commentator called Richard Dimbleby, and he was in an eyrie right up in the rafters of Westminster Abbey. And I can tell you this, Alex and Alex, when he whispered into his lip mic and he said, using the historical present tense, the Queen is crowned, I was 10 years old. The hair went up on the back of my neck, because it was a supreme moment. It was a very spiritual moment. It was something that nobody had ever seen outside the actual abbey before that time. This is going to be very, very different. But that history is brought into the coverage. It was such a big event in 1953 that CBS of America hired 3 airliners, and they shipped the film to America, processing it on the way in a machine inside the airplane, and then editing it ready for transmission. When they got to New York, they rushed it to the television station CBS, and they broadcast it coast to coast. The airplane behind had the later footage, and the airplane behind had more footage. It was that big an event, coast to coast broadcast. In this country, the only outrage was that the Americans, being Americans, ran commercials during the coronation, and one of the commercials starred a rather talented chimpanzee called J. Fred Muggs. And some people in Britain didn't see this as a sense of humour, and there was, some synthetic outrage about J. Fred Muggs being in the same broadcast, so to speak, as the coronation. But it was huge. This time, out of all proportion, all the major broadcasters of the world will be present, or they'll be taking the feed, and there will be a feed obviously from the BBC and also from ITV and other broadcasters.
I think it showed that the similarity between the two is that global interest in it. Now, obviously, the coronation, or the King's coronation, is going to be something that probably the majority have never seen something like it before. However, one thing many of us would have witnessed, and I believe you covered 5 of them, were the royal weddings.
Yes.
And would they compare to an event like this, or how would they be different when it comes to broadcasting them? Yeah,
I don't want to sound like Methuselah, but when I was a local paper reporter in 1962, which, to save you the maths, is 61 years ago, I wrote my first royal story. And when I was with ITV and then the BBC, I went around the world with various members of the royal family, with the Queen, from the jungles of Belize in Central America to the Great Wall of China and lots of places in between. And as you say, I covered 5 royal weddings. But this is something on a completely different scale. This is much, much bigger. And of course, a royal wedding is a time for celebration and what makes wonderful pictures. But this is very much more important to all of us. If we are lucky enough to live in a constitutional monarchy, which we are, this is the moment when the new monarch is crowned, when he takes into his hands literally the symbols of power, and he begins his reign. And whether the reign is long or short, this is the supreme moment for him. And we will see it in close and brilliant detail, never shot before in colour, except on film, which was shown in cinema newsreels. So the instant access to this coverage is going to be immense.
I think that's an interesting point as well, because I think the landscape has changed a lot now. People want their news now. They want it instantly. They don't just want it on broadcast on the TV. They want to be looking at it online. They want it on apps. So broadcasters are now having to think much further than linear broadcast. So even for us today, we're doing a podcast, traditionally an audio piece of work, but we're filming as well. So I guess there'll be more things in pies for broadcasters than just having to do one focus throughout the coronation.
I think more or less everybody who's got access to a screen will at some stage watch at least some of it, and people will take from it what they want to see. Some people will sit there and they'll be in there for the long term, and they'll see every last second of it and get from it. Other people just want a summary, or they just want to see the marching bands. It's pomp and circumstance. It's an ancient ritual, goes back 1,000 years, but it's it's street parties, it's celebration, it's all of that, and it's going to be, with an innovation, a major concert under the battlements of Windsor Castle. But as I say, it's a very spiritual occasion, and it's essential. Very few things in life are essential, but this is essential because the constitutional monarchy of the United Kingdom and 14 overseas realms couldn't exist but for this moment. And this is what we have. We have a Westminster system of government, which we've exported rather successfully around the world, to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia and other places. And it works really rather well. And I remember in 1953, when I was 10, the streets of London were thronged with people. There were sort of sun-tanned Australian troopers in their bush hats. There were Mounties in their red tunics, and there were Maoris in their traditional dress, people from Fiji, famously the Queen of Tonga in her open carriage, although it rained all day long. She was very popular because she didn't put the carriage roof up. All of this stuff you're going to get, and it's important to people. Surveys have said that people are less interested in it than they were. Well, that's understandable. We've moved on to a large extent. But in 1953, 3 million people were out on the streets of London to see the Queen, and she bounced around the whole of the West End twice in the Gold State coach. Rather uncomfortable, apparently it is. But she wanted everybody to see her. This time, the route is very much shorter. It's about a third of the length. It's essentially just up the Mall, through Admiralty Arch, turn right into Whitehall, Parliament Street, round Parliament Square to the west door of Westminster Abbey. But there will be huge crowds there. It won't be quite like last time. Of course it won't. We've moved on, and King Charles has said that he wants changes.
I think one of the things for me as well is that it's not, when it comes to coronation, I mean, we're doing this today, it's not just about the day of the coronation. It's a real uplift for communities, for everyone. And broadcasters look to cover it again, not just on the day, but building up to it. And there was coverage when the date was announced last year. That it's the full build up, and as we get closer and closer and the excitement builds, I wonder if you could share sort of any insight into what broadcasters look for in that build up so that they can encourage that excitement.
Well, it's a logistical nightmare, but they're used to living with a nightmare. Everything can be done given a goodwill on both sides. And, Her Majesty the Queen didn't often talk to me, but on one occasion she did say, that she said 50% of my job is being seen. She famously said, I have to be seen to be believed, which was a rather witty way of doing it. But it was important that she should be seen, and she always put that central. I can numerous incidents where if the cameras were not allowed in, she wasn't interested in being there, because and that's why she always wore bright colours, because she knew that she had to be seen by people. So she didn't necessarily like pastel colours, pinks, reds, and all the rest of it, but she knew she had to stand out. So it's very important. Buckingham Palace will have been working. The plan has been in existence for a long, long time, and all it had to be done is to dust it off a little, tweaked here and there, to make sure that everything is done. The equipment that is going to be used is far, far, far better, unimaginably better than it was in 1953, getting you the great shots on wonderful screens. I mean, it will be spectacular. It will be the greatest show on earth. Of course, people these days, they have entertainment on demand. They may be sated, they may be slightly bloated with all the entertainment they had. But if they miss this show, they're going to miss something that they're going to regret missing, because it will be spectacular. And even in terms of pomp and circumstances, famously, nobody can do it like the British. Well, now we've got the opportunity to show, because even, something that absolutely moved me when I covered the Queen's funeral, the shot that actually meant a great deal to me was the shot of the massed pipers coming around Parliament Square, past Queen St Margaret's Church, to the Abbey, all of them together. I had been the BBC Scotland correspondent at one time, and to see those mass pipes, I mean, it was nerve-tingling, and you're going to have a lot of those moments. And the King has spent virtually his whole life, 70 years, he's 74 now, since he was 4, he became heir to the throne, preparing for this moment. He obviously knew that would depend upon his much beloved mother dying, but he factored that in. He was prepared for this, and he's had a long apprenticeship, and it is the supreme moment. He's the supreme governor of the Church of England, and he will be there in that role, taking on the reins of power, and the whole world will be in the Abbey to see him. Much smaller congregation than at the time of Her Majesty the Queen's coronation. I don't know how they did it, but they got more than 8,000 people into the Abbey. Well, there's only going to be 2,300 this time. Well, I vaguely know how they did it, because they built grandstands actually within the nave to get extra people in. But I also do know, partly, how they paid for it. They paid for it because every peer, every lord, every duke, marquis, viscount who was there in their robes and coronets, they were allowed to buy the seat they sat in. They're rather nice velvety blue 1950s style seats. They were allowed to buy them, and guess how much they were? £5. But a fiver was worth about £65 now. And I've seen a couple of these chairs. So late Lord Somerleyton lived near where we used to, and he had a couple there. So they defrayed the cost. Bear in mind, in 53, we'd been through a war which had we'd bankrupted ourselves as a country, defending the free world against fascism, against Nazism. And we had 5 years, 6 years of austerity. In 53, we were just coming out of that. Rationing was just ending. A fresh, beautiful 26-year-old queen was about to ascend the throne. People felt, I felt, that there were better times around the corner. And people were optimistic.
You can take that, Joe, if you want at the end. If we ask nicely.
You
might get more than 65 quid for it.
I
just want to take you back to something really interesting you were saying about how the late Queen mentioned how she had to be seen to be heard, and she always wanted to make sure she was available for the press. How close is that relationship between broadcasters and the royals, and do they have much of a say in what's seen on over the coronation week or what's broadcast?
Well, they obviously don't have editorial control, nor would they seek editorial control. But some years ago, and it was an extremely good move, the palace appointed a person specifically to manage the television access. And it was a very talented and very pleasant man who'd been a cameraman at ITN. When I was on the road, I was the opposition to him. But they chose him for that role, and he did it extremely well because he could understand what the broadcasters wanted, and within reason, he would try to provide it. He was always accessible. He never got red carpet fever. He never imagined that he was more important because he was working for the palace. And he interacted with people like me very well, because we knew that he knew what he was doing, and obviously he respected that we had certain requirements. So the palace is very realistic about this. They realize that the public has not just got a right to know; they have to know. It's integral to what this country is all about. We have, this country, if the monarchy exists while it commands the great support and approval of the people. And while that continues, it's a system that will continue, because most people can see the value in having a constitutional monarchy. I think, well, two things I think. First of all, I think that having a monarch is one of our best defenses, our best guarantees against extremism and dictatorship. And I also think that having a monarchy somehow suits the British temperament. I think most people in Britain, faced with a presidency and having to vote for one or two or three people, they would react in horror, because anybody who allowed themselves to be put forward as a president, by definition, declares themselves to be the wrong sort of person, because we don't want people who've got the personal vanity and ambition to be in that position. In a way, we'd be much, much better to take pot luck. It's accident of birth. It's an hereditary monarchy. But in that time, you can have bad monarchs, of course you can, but you can have also brilliant monarchs. I mean, and most of them were women. Queen Elizabeth I an era of adventure and success and exploration. Queen Victoria, who was the previous record-holding length of reign, the last queen. On the day after she died, I had a letter in the Times when I suggested that she might be called Elizabeth the Great, because she had reigned so faultlessly throughout 70 years, which was some achievement, because for the whole of her life, she was under scrutiny every waking day of her life.
I think people are fascinated by these sorts of things, and the royal family and the world we live in nowadays. I think some people even see that the royal family as celebrities that they don't have access to. They live a completely different life to the rest of us. And when it comes to broadcast, and when it comes to broadcasters on weeks like this, and you're not going to be able to, as you said, you have no editorial control. You can't just knock on the palace door and say, "Can I have an interview?" There's nothing like that happens. So when broadcasters are looking to fill time and fill TV and radio coverage, presumably they'd look for guests like yourself that have these sort of stories. But is that the sort of thing, if you were editorially setting something up and you were booking guests to speak about the coronation, is it those types of people they would look for that have these stories that you're telling us now?
Yeah, well, I think you want people who know what they're talking about. There's so too few of them in the world, and people have been round the block a few times. You can't be as old as me without knowing something. But I think, Alex, you made an extremely good point, because it's a sort of natural thing, and contradict me if you think I'm wrong, but people actually measure the span of their own lives by saying, oh yeah, we got married at the same time as Diana and Charles. Our baby was born at the same time as Prince William. And they measure their own lives in a way, not in any sort of vainglorious way, but they do take these milestones and they take an interest in them. I think it's a mistake for the royal family at any time to try and be celebrities or something, because that's a game they'll never win. And they don't need to be. They're above all that. It shouldn't be an issue. They don't have to do anything to be admired. The King Charles, when he was Prince of Wales, he said, rather complaining, a bit Eeyore-ish, he said, my great-great-grandfather, Edward VII, he said he didn't have to do anything. He just came in a carriage and people saw him and they cheered, and he didn't have to make a speech. He didn't have to cut a ribbon. They just liked him. Well, he was sort of complaining that he has to do all the things he does do, and he does them quite effectively. And we can go into those at another time. But he was sort of saying that in a different age, in an age of deference, if you will, it was much, much easier. But you know something? If we take another short reign, because a short reign can also be a very successful reign. Edward VII, who was the big fat one with the beard, a little bit like yours, your beard.
The beard, not the fat.
The one, the King Edward potatoes, the King Edward cigar. Okay, he only reigned. He was the eldest son of Queen Victoria. He reigned from 1901 to 1910, and during that time, he was hugely successful. He had a Derby winner, which of course recommended him to the British public. He liked to eat and drink, and most of the British people like all that. He liked ladies. He was known not Edward the Confessor, but Edward the Caresser. He liked girls. And he did something very, very, very special. We'd been on extremely bad terms with France for years, for decades. And he went to France, and he was introduced to a famous French actress, and he kissed her hand and he said, "Madam, you're as beautiful as France itself." And that was the foundation stone. That sealed the entente cordiale that put us into an alliance with France, and we've been an ally of France ever since that day.
I should be making notes on these sorts of things.
There's no test afterwards. But he did. And so the Entente Cordiale, which, of course, when the First World War broke out, he'd already been dead 4 years. But, the Tommies in the trenches on the Western Front, they said none of this would have happened if King Teddy had been alive, because they felt that he would have had a word with his errant nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and he'd have said, "Look, Willie, stop all this nonsense. We don't want this war. They really believed that Edward VII, was a great king, and he gave his name to a golden era, which was called, in retrospect, the Edwardian era. And you know, fate, kismet, preordained events. Let me just tell you something. Edward VII, the great-great-grandfather of King Charles, died on May the 6th, 1910. He died on the date of the coronation. And very shortly before he died, his mistress-in-chief was allowed in to see him on his deathbed. The Queen, Alexandra, allowed Mrs. Alice Keppel in to see the king. And she was very distraught to see him about to die. On May the 6th, 2023, the king will be marrying the great-granddaughter of Mrs. Keppel. Camilla Shand was the great-granddaughter of Mrs. Alice Keppel. She became Mrs. Parker Bowles, and she's now going to become Queen Camilla. Now, isn't that extraordinary?
I think I'm finding all of this extraordinary, if I'm totally honest with you. One of the things I wanted to ask is...
But listen, I haven't finished.
Oh.
On that night, the Prime Minister, the night the King died, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, looked at a black sky and Halley's Comet went across it.
Memorable.
That was the end of an era, the end of the Edwardian era.
I think that leads me on to where I say memorable. I think something you mentioned, like royal births, royal weddings, is a timeline that people remember in their life. It's one of those moments where you go, I remember where I was when X, Y, Z happens, and I almost feel like the media look for that moment as well. That one photo, that one shot, that one piece of audio that when people see it or hear it in 50 years' time, they'll go, yeah, I know where I was for that. And what will be what I'm almost trying to ask, and I don't know if you know the answer, of what will that moment be at this coronation?
Well, it will be something very special and personal to them. I mean, I spoke about hearing Richard Dimbleby saying the Queen is crowned, and that went home to me as a 10-year-old. And we didn't go to the coronation. We lived in northwest London, but that week, my mother took my sister, who's 18 months older than me, so she was 11, I was 10, to the Trooping of the Colour. The Trooping of the Colour was the next Saturday after the coronation. And so we went, and I know exactly where we stood, near Duke of York steps, and my mother bought for 2 shillings, which is a tenth of a pound, 10 pence essentially, a cardboard and mirror periscope for us to try and see the parade. And I remember, I think I saw the backside of the horse of the Queen going by and all the soldiers, but I was there, and people will find a personal moment that it means something to them. And there's so much in the ceremony which will resonate with people and for all their lives. And it's not just mumbo jumbo. It is hugely symbolic. And although it is not democratic in that sense, the fact that there is this element of consent by the king and consent by the people there, you wouldn't get that in the Romanov, the Russian royal family, or the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, or the Habsburgs of Vienna. Yeah. There's no consent. Napoleon crowned himself. There wasn't any consent about that.
I think you used the word there, which is quite key. And will be something that's spoken about in newsrooms across the world, people. It always comes back to the people, because we've spoken about the big pageantry, we've spoken about the actual moment in the coronation, but across the country there'll be street parties. And actually you've worked in local news as well as, your BBC days in national. And I think sometimes local news is as important as the big broadcasters to find those special moments, to find those special stories, the brilliant people, and those, no one apart from local journalists are intertwined in their local community. How important will they be in the coronation?
Vitally important. Listen, I started in local papers and regional papers. They are the lifeblood of journalism in this country. And every single newspaper worth its salt will be finding a local angle on this. Every single royal page, whatever their age, they will be featured in a local paper because they're the son of the local, whatever it is, and they go to the local school. All of that goes on, and all the people, because the king has also requested that holders of the British Empire Medal, and there's quite a selection of them, will be there. And these are the people. The British Empire Medal is probably the most modest honour you can get. And that goes to people who've served their local community. I'm not saying lollipop men or dinner ladies, but it's people who've done something real in the community. And he's insisted that they are going to be there. It doesn't matter that a few peers and lords won't be there, but they will be there.
I think that leads nicely to actually I could talk to you for hours, but my final question, which is where are you going to be for the coronation? What will you be doing?
Well, I'm going to. I do what I'm told. I'm married. Okay. Actually, I haven't been told what I'm going to do, but I'm going to be working for an Australian news channel. I can name them if you wish me to. Sky News Australia. I'm going to be working for GB News, the news channel here. I may be working for Talk TV. I may be working for Al Jazeera. I know that I'm going to be doing an interview for AP, which is the biggest news agency in the world. Yeah. I mean, essentially, I'm there to help with the coverage because, as I said, you can't live as long as I have without knowing a thing or two. And there is I'm not saying in a pejorative sense, but there is a lot of ignorance and misinformation. And I try to keep it back onto what this is all about. I mean, His Majesty the King has said he wants a slimmed down coronation. And that means reducing the number of people in the Abbey. But it also means reducing the focus and keeping the focus tight on the line of succession. And the line of succession after himself, of course, is Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and then his three children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. And interestingly, since the Commonwealth made a change, the girls have an equal place in the line of succession. And he wants to keep it that way. And he's also changed it in another clever way, because in previous coronations, every royal prince there present has been required to kneel and say an oath of fealty, of loyalty to the new king. But the king has said, no, we will only have Prince William. And that means that Prince Andrew, who has got his own little dark cloud over his head, unfortunately for him, and Prince Harry, who will also be there, who is a controversial figure, at least in this country, they will not be required to kneel and play an active part in the coronation. They will be there, they will observe it, and of course neither will Prince Edward or Prince Michael or the Duke of Kent or the Duke of Gloucester, who are also royal princes. They won't have to do that.
I think, well, we'll all be there in some ways, but perhaps not kneeling or doing anything, but we'll all be there and be absolutely fascinated with everything that's going on. I've been fascinated by some of the stories you've told us, and I look forward to seeing you on many of those channels that you just mentioned, that you're going to be probably retelling some of these stories that you've just done.
Well, you'll deserve a sleep by the end of it.
Thank you so much for sparing your time on what I'm assuming is an extremely busy time for Beyond the Broadcast. But that is all we've got time for. So thank you for listening and watching this episode of Beyond the Broadcast. Thank you for Alex, and a big thank you to Michael for joining us and sharing those fascinating stories. Please don't forget to subscribe and follow Marketeers on all the socials. This has been Beyond the Broadcast, and we are Marketeers.
Beyond the Broadcast is brought to you by Markettiers, the UK's leading broadcast PR agency. We have almost 30 years' experience of producing market-leading, award-winning campaigns, generating local, regional, national and international coverage. That's on modern channels such as live streaming, mobile and social media, as well as traditional media such as TV and radio.